Ladies and gentlemen, today we delve into one of the darkest chapters of Brazil's history, the Carandiru Massacre. The Carandiru Massacre is considered one of the most brutal prison killings in modern history, occurring on October 2nd, 1992, inside Carandiru Penitentiary, a massive prison complex located in São Paulo, Brazil. This tragic event was the result of a violent prison riot, which started as a minor altercation between inmates but quickly escalated into a full-scale conflict. Carandiru, at the time, was known as one of the most overcrowded and violent prisons in South America, housing thousands of inmates under dire conditions. On the morning of October 2nd, tensions inside the prison had already been rising. Inmates lived in cramped, unsanitary, and inhumane conditions, with little access to basic necessities such as clean water, proper medical care, or even enough space to sleep. Violence among prisoners was common, and control over various sections of the prison often rested in the hands of powerful criminal factions rather than the prison authorities. The lack of proper management and resources turned Carandiru into a ticking time bomb, ready to explode at any moment. When a dispute broke out between two rival factions, it quickly spread through different sections of the prison. Prison guards were unable to contain the violence, and as the situation spiraled out of control, the authorities decided to call in the military police of São Paulo, known for their heavy-handed tactics and willingness to use lethal force. By the time the police force arrived, the riot had already begun to subside, and many prisoners were attempting to surrender or retreat to their cells. However, instead of using de-escalation tactics, the police stormed the prison with overwhelming force, unleashing one of the deadliest crackdowns in Brazil's history. The massacre unfolded over several hours as police units moved systematically through the prison, shooting indiscriminately. While initial reports claimed that the police were acting in self-defense, later investigations and eyewitness accounts revealed a much darker truth. Many prisoners were executed in cold blood, shot multiple times, even after surrendering. Some were lined up and killed in their cells, while others were chased down and slaughtered in hallways and courtyards. In total, 111 inmates lost their lives, most of them from gunshot wounds. Shockingly, not a single police officer was killed or seriously injured, leading to allegations that the operation was nothing more than a state-sanctioned massacre rather than a riot response. The sheer brutality of the Carandiru massacre sent shockwaves throughout Brazil and the world. News of the event spread rapidly, and human rights organizations began demanding accountability. However, in the immediate aftermath, the government and law enforcement attempted to justify their actions, claiming that the police had no choice but to use lethal force. It would take decades before any meaningful justice was even considered for the victims. This massacre is remembered as one of the darkest moments in Brazil's criminal justice history, exposing the deep flaws within the prison system, the culture of police brutality, and the urgent need for reform. It remains a haunting reminder of how unchecked power and a lack of oversight can lead to unimaginable atrocities, even within institutions meant to uphold law and order. The Carandiru Massacre was one of the deadliest incidents of state violence in Brazilian history, resulting in the deaths of 111 prisoners at the hands of the São Paulo military police. What makes this tragedy even more horrifying is the manner in which these prisoners were killed. Many were not just casualties of a riot suppression operation, but victims of outright execution. When the riot initially broke out inside Carandiru Penitentiary on October 2nd, 1992, tensions were high, but the situation had begun to calm before the police intervention. Instead of attempting to negotiate with the prisoners or contain the violence through non-lethal means, the government authorized an extreme show of force, calling in heavily armed military police units. The police entered the prison with the intent not just to control the situation but to crush the uprising with brutal efficiency. Eyewitnesses, including surviving prisoners and even some law enforcement personnel, later testified that most of the 111 prisoners were not killed in combat but were executed in cold blood. Many were shot inside their cells at point-blank range after they had already surrendered. Others were chased down and gunned down in hallways, staircases, and prison courtyards. Some were reportedly forced to kneel before being shot, while others were trapped in rooms where they were slaughtered without any chance to escape. The forensic evidence further confirmed the excessive and disproportionate use of force by the police. Autopsies revealed that many victims had multiple gunshot wounds, often in areas such as the head, chest, and back, which suggested they were executed rather than killed in crossfire. Some bodies showed signs that they had been shot while lying down or after already being incapacitated. One of the most shocking aspects of the massacre was the complete lack of resistance from the prisoners by the time the police stormed in. While the initial riot involved fights between rival gangs, it did not turn into a battle against the authorities. Many inmates locked themselves in their cells or raised their hands in surrender, believing they would be arrested rather than executed. However, the police showed no mercy, systematically moving through the prison blocks, shooting prisoners indiscriminately. Despite the overwhelming number of deaths on one side, not a single police officer was killed or seriously injured during the operation. This further fueled suspicions that the massacre was not an act of self-defense, but a deliberate act of mass murder. The staggering 111 deaths made it clear that the police had been given a license to kill, with no regard for human rights, legal procedures, or basic morality. The massacre was not just a random act of violence, it was a symbol of the systemic brutality and corruption within Brazil's prison and law enforcement systems. The fact that so many lives were lost in a matter of hours, without any consequences for the officers involved at the time, showed the level of impunity enjoyed by the police when dealing with prisoners, especially those from marginalized communities. The scale of the killings shocked the world, drawing condemnation from human rights organizations, legal experts, and activists. However, in the immediate aftermath, the Brazilian government and law enforcement attempted to justify the deaths, claiming that the police had acted in the interest of public safety. It would take decades for any legal action to be taken against those responsible, and even then, justice remained elusive for many of the victims' families. Carandiru Penitentiary was not just any prison. It was the largest correctional facility in South America, originally built in 1920 to house around 3,500 inmates. However, by 1992, when the massacre took place, the prison population had swelled to over 8,000 prisoners, more than twice its intended capacity. This extreme overcrowding created a nightmarish environment where inmates lived in horrific, inhumane conditions, struggling for even the most basic necessities. The prison was designed in a way that made it impossible to control once it became overcrowded. The old, crumbling buildings were divided into multiple pavilions, and each pavilion housed far more prisoners than it could handle. Inside, there were tiny, dark cells meant for 4 or 5 people but often crammed with more than 10. The air was thick with the stench of sweat, urine, and decay, as sanitation was nearly non-existent. The prison lacked proper plumbing, forcing inmates to share filthy toilets and makeshift latrines that were constantly overflowing. Running water was scarce, and food rations were often insufficient, leading to malnutrition and illness among the inmates. This level of neglect and mismanagement turned Carandiru into a breeding ground for disease, violence, and death. Tuberculosis, HIV, and other infectious diseases spread rapidly due to poor medical care and unsanitary conditions. Many prisoners suffered from untreated wounds, infections, and chronic illnesses, while medical attention was either delayed or denied altogether. The prison authorities showed little to no concern for the well-being of the inmates, treating them as disposable rather than as human beings deserving of even the most basic rights. Beyond the physical suffering, the psychological toll of living in such a brutal environment was immense. Inmates were constantly under stress, fearing not only the cruelty of prison guards but also violence from fellow prisoners. The overcrowding meant that conflicts were inevitable. Gangs and criminal factions ran much of the prison, imposing their own form of rule, where weaker inmates were often victimized. Murders, assaults, and sexual violence were commonplace, and the prison staff either ignored these incidents or actively participated in the brutality. Adding to the chaos, there was little separation between different types of inmates. First-time offenders, petty criminals, and non-violent prisoners were often mixed with hardened criminals, gang leaders, and murderers, leading to a dangerous power imbalance. The lack of proper classification and security measures made Carandiru a lawless jungle, where survival depended on alliances with gangs or bribing corrupt prison staff. The Brazilian justice system at the time was notorious for its inefficiency, leading to many inmates being held for years without trial. Some prisoners had never even been convicted of a crime, yet they were forced to endure the same suffering as the most violent offenders. The lack of due process meant that many were essentially forgotten by the system, left to rot in overcrowded cells without any hope of release or fair treatment. This overwhelming breakdown of order and human rights inside Carandiru made it a powder keg waiting to explode. With thousands of desperate, mistreated men crammed into a space built for less than half their number, it was only a matter of time before tensions erupted into violence. When the riot broke out on October 2, 1992, it was not just about gang disputes, it was the result of years of neglect, corruption, and abuse. The government's failure to address the appalling conditions inside the prison directly contributed to the events that led to the massacre, making the tragedy not just an act of police brutality, but also a testament to the failure of Brazil's prison system as a whole. The Carandiru Massacre was triggered by what initially seemed like a routine prison fight, a clash between rival gangs inside Pavilion 9, one of the most dangerous sections of the prison. However, what began as a relatively contained brawl quickly spiraled out of control, exposing the deep-rooted issues of violence, mismanagement, and corruption within Brazil's prison system. Like many prisons around the world, Carandiru was not just a place of confinement, it was a breeding ground for organized crime. Gangs inside the prison held enormous power, often more than the guards themselves. These gangs provided protection, controlled the flow of contraband such as drugs and weapons, and enforced their own brutal form of justice. Rival factions constantly fought for dominance, and when tensions boiled over, violent confrontations were inevitable. On the morning of October 2, 1992, a heated argument broke out between two groups of inmates over an issue that remains unclear to this day. Some reports suggest it was related to territorial disputes over control of certain areas within the prison, while others claim it was a personal feud between two prisoners. Regardless of the cause, what started as a verbal dispute soon turned into a physical altercation. As tempers flared, more inmates joined the fight, escalating the situation into a full-blown riot. With over 8,000 prisoners crammed into the facility, conflicts could easily spread like wildfire. Within minutes, chaos erupted in Pavilion 9. Prisoners armed themselves with makeshift weapons such as sharpened metal rods, broken glass, and wooden clubs. The prison guards, already outnumbered, quickly realized they had lost control. A crucial failure in prison management contributed to the escalation. Normally, when riots break out, trained negotiators or riot control officers are deployed to defuse the situation before it gets worse. However, Carandiru had a long history of brutal suppression tactics instead of diplomatic solutions. The guards, fearing for their safety, decided to lock down the pavilion and call for reinforcements rather than attempt any negotiations. With the prisoners left to fight among themselves, the situation deteriorated further. Reports suggest that fires were set, and prisoners began smashing through barriers, trying to take control of different sections of the prison. The noise, smoke, and panic made it nearly impossible to distinguish between rioters and those simply trying to escape the violence. Some inmates, realizing that a full-scale crackdown was coming, attempted to surrender or retreat to their cells, but by then, it was too late. The police response was swift and deadly. The military police of São Paulo were called in, known for their aggressive, no-tolerance approach to dealing with riots. Rather than assessing the situation or trying to de-escalate tensions, the police stormed the prison in a show of overwhelming force, fully armed with rifles, shotguns, and pistols. From that moment on, it was no longer a prison riot, it became a massacre. This tragic sequence of events, starting as a simple fight between inmates and escalating into a deadly military intervention, reflects the deep systemic failures of Carandiru. The lack of proper inmate management, overcrowding, gang dominance, and an excessive use of force by authorities all combined to create the perfect storm for what would become one of the darkest days in Brazil's history. When the military police of São Paulo were called to suppress the riot inside Carandiru Penitentiary on October 2, 1992, they responded with an unprecedented level of violence. Rather than using negotiation tactics, non-lethal force, or containment strategies, they launched an all-out assault on the prison, treating the inmates as enemies rather than human beings. At the time, the military police had a notorious reputation for using heavy-handed tactics, particularly when dealing with poor or marginalized communities. Carandiru housed some of the most vulnerable prisoners, many of whom were pretrial detainees, petty criminals, or individuals awaiting sentencing. Despite this, they were met with the same brutality as hardened criminals or violent gang leaders. Eyewitnesses and survivors of the massacre later described the horrific nature of the police invasion. Hundreds of heavily armed officers stormed the prison, moving from cell to cell, unleashing a relentless wave of gunfire. The sound of gunshots echoed through the prison walls as inmates scrambled to escape the onslaught. Many prisoners tried to surrender by raising their hands or locking themselves in their cells, but it made no difference. The police showed no mercy. Forensic investigations conducted after the massacre revealed shocking evidence of execution-style killings. Many prisoners were shot multiple times at point-blank range, indicating that they were not killed in self-defense, but deliberately executed. Some were found with gunshot wounds to the back of the head or chest, suggesting they were either kneeling or lying down when they were shot. Others were shot in their beds or cornered in hallways, unable to escape the slaughter. A particularly chilling detail emerged when investigators discovered that some of the bodies had bullet wounds in areas that suggested they had been tortured before being killed. Prisoners who had already been incapacitated were beaten, stabbed, and then finished off with gunfire. Blood-stained walls, bullet-ridden doors, and shattered cells bore witness to the scale of the brutality that took place that day. Despite the overwhelming disparity in force, the police suffered no casualties. Not a single officer was killed or seriously injured. This fact alone contradicted the official police narrative, which initially claimed that the operation was a defensive response to a violent riot. If this were true, it would have been expected that the police would have suffered at least some losses in combat. Instead, the evidence painted a grim picture of a systematic massacre rather than a riot control operation. One of the most damning aspects of the police operation was the complete disregard for proper riot control measures. In modern law enforcement, prison riots are typically handled with negotiations, non-lethal weapons, and strategic intervention. However, in Carandiru, no attempt was made to negotiate or use less lethal methods like tear gas, rubber bullets, or water cannons. Instead, the police immediately resorted to live ammunition, ensuring a high death toll. Another troubling detail was the deliberate destruction of evidence following the massacre. Reports indicate that police officers moved and altered the positions of the bodies to make the killings appear more justified. Official records were manipulated, and in the immediate aftermath, the Brazilian government attempted to downplay the scale of the massacre, presenting it as a necessary crackdown on dangerous criminals. However, as survivor testimonies and forensic reports emerged, the truth of the mass execution became undeniable. The excessive and unjustified use of force at Carandiru did not just claim 111 lives, it sent a chilling message about the unchecked power of Brazil's law enforcement agencies. It demonstrated how state violence could be carried out with impunity, particularly against those considered disposable by society. The massacre was not just an act of brutality, it was a symbol of a deeply flawed justice system that prioritized punishment over rehabilitation, violence over law, and extermination over human rights. In the immediate aftermath of the Carandiru Massacre, the Brazilian government and law enforcement agencies attempted to justify the bloodshed, framing it as a necessary operation to restore order within a dangerously out-of-control prison. Officials downplayed the brutality of the police response, insisting that the military police of São Paulo had no choice but to use lethal force against the rioting prisoners. This official stance was met with skepticism and outrage, both within Brazil and internationally, as evidence began to emerge contradicting the claims of self-defense. The government's initial statements following the massacre were aimed at dismissing concerns of human rights violations. Officials portrayed the inmates as violent criminals, claiming they had posed an immediate threat to both law enforcement and prison staff. According to this narrative, the riot was uncontrollable, and the only way to prevent further destruction and bloodshed was to eliminate the threat. This argument was particularly effective in gaining public support, as many Brazilians at the time viewed prisoners, especially those involved in organized crime, as undeserving of sympathy or legal protections. One of the leading figures defending the police operation was Colonel Overturned Guimarães, the officer in charge of the military police response. He publicly praised the actions of his forces, arguing that they had conducted a professional and disciplined operation to put down a violent rebellion. He even went so far as to state that the police had acted with restraint, despite overwhelming forensic evidence suggesting execution-style killings. Guimarães became a controversial figure, hailed as a hero by some and condemned as a mass murderer by others. Despite the government's initial justifications, human rights organizations and legal experts quickly challenged the official version of events. The first major contradiction in the police narrative was the fact that not a single officer was killed or seriously injured. If the riot had been as dangerous as authorities claimed, it was unlikely that the police would have suffered 0 casualties while killing 111 prisoners. This raised serious questions about whether the operation had been a defensive measure or a premeditated massacre. As more details emerged, it became impossible to ignore the systematic execution of inmates. Forensic reports showed that most prisoners were shot multiple times, often at close range, and many had been gunned down inside their locked cells. Survivor testimonies described how police moved through the prison, executing inmates indiscriminately, regardless of whether they had participated in the riot or not. These findings directly contradicted the government's claim that police had fired only in self-defense. However, the political climate at the time favored a hardline approach to crime, and the government sought to use the massacre as an example of its tough stance on law and order. Brazil in the early 1990s was grappling with rising crime rates, economic instability, and a public increasingly frustrated with violence. Many politicians capitalized on the massacre, arguing that it sent a strong message to criminals that the state would not tolerate lawlessness. This public support for harsh policing measures allowed the government to delay any meaningful investigation or accountability for years. Adding to the controversy, some officials manipulated the media narrative, emphasizing the criminal records of the deceased inmates while avoiding discussions about the unlawful executions that had taken place. Some newspapers and television reports at the time echoed the government's stance, reinforcing the idea that the massacre was justified. However, as international human rights organizations began pressuring Brazil for transparency, the official story started to crumble. Over time, public opinion became divided. While some segments of Brazilian society supported the government's tough stance on crime, others began to question the lack of accountability for the killings. Protests erupted, led by activists, legal experts, and families of the victims, demanding that the massacre be properly investigated. The government's initial attempt to cover up the scale of the killings only fueled further outrage, forcing authorities to re-examine the events that had taken place inside Carandiru. Despite growing evidence of state-sanctioned brutality, legal proceedings against those responsible for the massacre would take decades to unfold. The delay in justice highlighted the deep corruption and flaws within Brazil's judicial and law enforcement systems, exposing the dangerous levels of impunity enjoyed by the police. The government's defense of the massacre was not just an attempt to protect its officers, it was a reflection of a broader culture of systemic violence, disregard for prisoners' rights, and an unwillingness to hold law enforcement accountable for its actions. In the aftermath of the Carandiru Massacre, official investigations and forensic reports painted a disturbing picture of cold-blooded executions, contradicting the Brazilian government's initial claims that the killings were a necessary response to a violent riot. While authorities tried to frame the incident as a police operation to restore order, forensic evidence, survivor testimonies, and human rights investigations exposed the reality of mass executions inside the prison. The first major indication that the police narrative was false came from autopsy reports. Medical examiners found that the majority of the 111 inmates killed were shot multiple times at close range, often in execution-style killings. Many bodies had bullet wounds in the back of the head, chest, or face, suggesting that prisoners were either kneeling, lying down, or had already been subdued when they were shot. Some were killed in their cells, bathrooms, and stairwells, places where they would have had no chance to pose a threat to the police. One of the most damning pieces of evidence was that not a single police officer was killed or seriously injured during the operation. If the police had truly been engaged in a deadly riot suppression effort, it would have been expected that at least some officers would have sustained casualties. Instead, it became clear that the police had complete control over the situation and that what took place inside Carandiru was not a battle, but a massacre. Survivor testimonies provided further confirmation of the brutality of the operation. Former inmates who lived through the attack described how the police moved systematically through the prison, going from cell to cell, executing prisoners indiscriminately. Some prisoners tried to surrender, raising their hands or locking themselves inside their cells, but the police forced their way in and shot them anyway. Others were dragged into hallways, lined up against walls, and executed one by one. One survivor, whose account was later used in legal proceedings, recalled how police officers laughed and made jokes as they shot inmates. Some officers reportedly tortured prisoners before killing them, using knives and batons to beat and stab them before finishing them off with gunfire. Blood poured through the hallways, staining the floors, walls, and ceilings. The stench of death filled the air, and bodies lay piled on top of each other, riddled with bullets. Another horrific discovery made during investigations was the sheer number of gunshots fired by the police. According to forensic reports, over 515 bullets were found in the bodies of the deceased prisoners, meaning that each victim had been shot multiple times. Many had bullets lodged in their skulls, hearts, and backs, reinforcing the theory that they had been executed rather than killed in crossfire. Further complicating the police's justification for the massacre was the evidence of tampering and destruction of proof. Reports suggest that after the killings, officers moved bodies, altered crime scenes, and removed shell casings to make it appear as if the police had been engaged in a gunfight rather than a mass execution. Some records of the operation went missing, and authorities attempted to manipulate forensic evidence to align with their fabricated version of events. The scale of the massacre and the attempt to cover it up led to national and international outrage. Human rights organizations, legal experts, and activists called for a thorough investigation, demanding that the responsible officers be held accountable. However, due to deep-rooted corruption and a justice system that often protected law enforcement, the investigations were slow, and justice was repeatedly delayed. It took years before authorities acknowledged the full extent of the atrocities, and even longer before any of the officers involved faced prosecution. The Carandiru Massacre investigations exposed not only the horrific nature of the killings, but also the widespread culture of impunity within Brazil's police force. The findings confirmed that what happened inside the prison was not a riot control operation gone wrong, but a deliberate and systematic extermination of prisoners, carried out by a police force that believed it would never be held accountable for its actions. The Carandiru Massacre did not go unnoticed. As news of the brutal execution of 111 prisoners spread, human rights organizations, activists, legal experts, and the families of the victims began demanding answers. What had been initially framed by the Brazilian government as a justified police operation quickly unraveled into a major scandal, exposing the deep corruption, violence, and lack of accountability within Brazil's justice system. In the days immediately following the massacre, public opinion was divided. Some Brazilians, particularly those who had grown weary of rising crime rates, believed the prisoners got what they deserved. The government and police used this sentiment to their advantage, portraying the operation as a necessary crackdown on criminals. However, as more details of the massacre emerged, forensic reports, survivor testimonies, and leaked internal documents, the tide of opinion began to shift. Human rights organizations, both domestic and international, were among the first to condemn the massacre. Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch issued strong statements criticizing the excessive use of force and calling for an independent investigation. The United Nations also weighed in, expressing concern over Brazil's treatment of prisoners and the lack of accountability for police violence. The massacre became a stain on Brazil's international reputation, forcing the government to address growing criticism from the global community. Protests broke out in multiple cities, led by activists, students, and families of the victims. Demonstrators held up signs that read "Justice for Carandiru" and "The police are the real criminals" as they marched through the streets of São Paulo. The protests were not just about the massacre itself. They became a rallying cry against Brazil's long history of police brutality, corruption, and state-sponsored violence. Legal battles soon followed, as survivors and the families of the deceased pushed for justice. However, Brazil's legal system was notoriously slow and corrupt, and many feared that the case would be buried, forgotten, or dismissed altogether. The first few years after the massacre saw little to no progress in holding anyone accountable. The police officers involved in the killings continued to work freely, and the commanding officer, Colonel Overturned Guimarães, remained in his position. At first, the government tried to avoid legal consequences by delaying investigations and protecting the officers involved. The military police force claimed that they had acted in self-defense, and early court rulings seemed to favor their version of events. However, as more eyewitness accounts and forensic evidence surfaced, it became clear that Carandiru was not a case of riot suppression, it was mass murder. The slow pace of justice led to even more public outcry, pushing authorities to eventually reopen investigations. International pressure mounted, with human rights groups demanding that those responsible be held accountable. As Brazil transitioned further into democracy in the late 1990s and early 2000s, the country faced increasing demands for police reform, and the Carandiru Massacre remained at the center of this debate. Despite the protests, legal battles, and international condemnation, the road to justice for Carandiru was long and frustrating. The case exposed deep flaws in Brazil's justice system, revealing how police forces operated with impunity. Prison conditions were inhumane, and government officials were willing to cover up mass killings rather than seek accountability. The massacre became a symbol of everything wrong with Brazil's criminal justice system, fueling debates over prison reform, police militarization, and human rights abuses. For years after the Carandiru Massacre, justice seemed like an impossible dream. The Brazilian legal system, notorious for its slow and bureaucratic processes, allowed the case to drag on for decades. The families of the 111 murdered prisoners, along with human rights activists and legal experts, faced an uphill battle in their quest to hold those responsible accountable. While the massacre had sparked international condemnation and widespread protests, real legal action against the perpetrators was painfully slow. At first, it appeared that the police officers involved would escape justice entirely. The government and law enforcement officials stonewalled investigations, and in the years immediately following the massacre, few serious attempts were made to prosecute those responsible. The São Paulo military police remained one of the most powerful institutions in Brazil, and they had a long history of avoiding accountability for violent crackdowns on civilians, especially against marginalized communities and prisoners. One of the biggest challenges in bringing the perpetrators to justice was the complexity of the case itself. The massacre involved hundreds of officers, and proving individual responsibility for the killings was difficult. Many of the officers who participated in the operation refused to speak, and key evidence had been tampered with or destroyed. Survivors and forensic experts testified about the execution-style killings, but with so many officers involved, pinpointing who fired which shots was nearly impossible. Despite these obstacles, the legal battle continued, and in 2001, a significant milestone was reached. Colonel Overturned Guimarães, the commander of the police operation, was convicted of the killings. He was sentenced to 632 years in prison, a historic verdict that signaled that some level of accountability was possible. However, the victory was short-lived. His conviction was overturned in 2006 on the basis of a legal technicality, allowing him to walk free. The news outraged human rights activists and the families of the victims, who saw it as yet another example of how the Brazilian justice system protected those in power. Just a few months after his acquittal, Guimarães was mysteriously assassinated in his São Paulo apartment. The circumstances surrounding his murder remain unclear, but many speculated that it was an act of revenge, either by the families of Carandiru victims or by members of organized crime groups within Brazil's prisons. His death fueled even more speculation and debate, but it did little to bring justice for the 111 prisoners slaughtered under his command. The real turning point in the case came years later. In 2013, more than 2 decades after the massacre, courts finally convicted dozens of police officers involved in the killings. A total of 74 officers were sentenced to more than 150 years each for their roles in the massacre. The verdict was seen as a symbolic victory, a rare moment where Brazil's legal system stood up against police brutality. However, many of the convicted officers remained free while they appealed their sentences, a common tactic in Brazil's slow-moving and often corrupt legal system. The convictions were hailed as a victory by human rights groups, but many activists argued that justice had come far too late. The fact that it took more than 20 years for the courts to even begin punishing those responsible was seen as an indictment of Brazil's broken justice system. By the time the trials concluded, many of the victims' families had passed away, and others had long lost hope that justice would ever be served. To make matters worse, in 2018, the Brazilian Supreme Court overturned the convictions, citing procedural errors in the trial process. This decision effectively erased the punishments, allowing the officers to go free once again. The ruling was met with international criticism, as it reinforced the idea that police officers could commit atrocities with little fear of consequences. The families of the victims and human rights organizations continued to fight, but the legal setbacks made true justice feel even more distant. Even as legal battles continued, many saw the Carandiru Massacre as a symbol of Brazil's deep-rooted issues with police brutality, impunity, and systemic corruption. While some convictions were achieved, the failure to consistently uphold them demonstrated how difficult it was to hold law enforcement accountable in a country where state violence was often normalized. The legal struggles surrounding Carandiru did not just reflect a single case of injustice. They highlighted the broader failures of Brazil's criminal justice system, where victims of state violence were often ignored, forgotten, or deliberately silenced. The Carandiru Massacre of 1992 was more than just a tragic loss of life. It became a turning point in Brazil's ongoing struggles with police brutality, prison conditions, and human rights violations. The event exposed the brutal realities of Brazil's justice system, where prisoners, many of whom had not even been convicted, were treated as if they had no rights, no dignity, and no chance for redemption. The massacre left an indelible scar on the nation's history, forcing Brazil to confront the deep-rooted problems within its prison and law enforcement systems. For many, Carandiru symbolized the worst aspects of Brazil's approach to criminal justice. The massacre revealed how the state relied on excessive force, particularly against the poor and marginalized. It showed that police acted with impunity, knowing they would rarely be held accountable for their actions. Even decades later, human rights organizations and legal experts continued to reference Carandiru as a case study in state violence, emphasizing how the massacre fit into a larger pattern of police brutality and judicial failure in Brazil. In the years following the massacre, there were increasing calls for prison reform, both domestically and internationally. Brazil's prisons were notorious for being overcrowded, violent, and inhumane. Carandiru itself, before its demolition, had been a symbol of the country's failing prison system, a place where thousands of inmates were crammed into conditions that were breeding grounds for disease, gang violence, and riots. The massacre also brought attention to the role of police militarization in Brazil. The fact that the military police were called in to handle a prison riot instead of trained negotiators or prison officials reflected the aggressive, warlike approach that authorities took toward crime. The brutality with which the police stormed the prison, executing prisoners at close range, leaving no room for surrender, and ensuring that not a single officer was harmed, demonstrated that this was never about regaining control. It was about sending a message of fear and dominance. Carandiru became a rallying cry for human rights activists who continued to push for justice, reform, and accountability. The massacre was widely cited in discussions about the need to demilitarize Brazil's police force, improve prison conditions, and establish greater oversight of law enforcement agencies. However, progress remained slow, and Brazil's prison system continued to suffer from overcrowding, violence, and abuse in the years that followed. One of the most visible legacies of the massacre was the eventual demolition of Carandiru Prison in 2002. After standing for a decade as a haunting reminder of the brutality that occurred within its walls, the facility was torn down and replaced with a public park and a cultural center. The destruction of the prison was meant to symbolize a new era for Brazil's approach to justice, but many critics saw it as a way for the government to erase the physical evidence of its crimes, rather than address the systemic problems that led to the massacre in the first place. While the prison itself was demolished, the impact of the massacre lived on, not only in legal battles and human rights debates, but also in Brazil's prison gangs and organized crime networks. The massacre played a major role in fueling the rise of the Primeiro Comando de Capital, PCC, one of the most powerful and violent criminal organizations in Brazil. Formed inside the prisons as a direct response to the state's violent treatment of inmates, the PCC vowed to protect prisoners from state brutality and take revenge for the massacre. Over the years, the gang grew into a dominant force in Brazil's criminal underworld, controlling drug trafficking, prison uprisings, and organized crime activities throughout the country. In many ways, the violence unleashed by the Carandiru Massacre did not end in 1992. It continued to shape the rise of criminal networks and cycles of retribution in Brazil for decades to come. Internationally, Carandiru became one of the most infamous cases of state violence in Latin America. Human rights organizations used the massacre as an example of why countries needed to reform their prison systems, implement police accountability measures, and ensure that prisoners, no matter their crimes, were treated with dignity and due process. The massacre was referenced in documentaries, books, and films, most notably in the 2003 Brazilian film Carandiru, which depicted the harsh realities of life inside the prison and the tragic events of the massacre. Despite all the outrage, legal battles, and discussions about reform, many of the issues that led to the Carandiru Massacre remained present in Brazil. Police brutality continued, with law enforcement carrying out extrajudicial killings in favelas, often targeting young, poor, black men. The country's prison system remained one of the most overcrowded in the world, with conditions that human rights groups continued to describe as inhumane. While Carandiru forced a conversation about police violence and prison reform, it did not lead to the sweeping changes many had hoped for. Carandiru was not just a massacre, it was a warning sign of the deep structural problems within Brazil's justice system. The failure to fully address the crimes committed by the police, the long delays in justice, and the ongoing cycles of violence demonstrated that Brazil had yet to truly confront the legacy of Carandiru.